This meeting is being recorded as the voice says. We will now share screen. See if it works first time around. Okay, we'll try it again. Well, there you go. Okay, so welcome. Hey folks, all right, we are starting. Welcome. This is going to be an exciting program, as you saw from the advanced publicity. We're going to expand our study of Ruach Hakodesh meditation with the focus on Gehenom. What sins are evil? How does the pursuit of Ruach Hakodesh help us avoid these sins? Our source will be the research of a Jewish scholar named Judith S. Antonelli and her book In the Image of God, which we'll talk about her in a few minutes. And then we'll finish up with a continuation of our discussion on how to understand distractions to improve your meditative practice. Where are we now? We are here in the section of Ruach Hakodesh, or known as Enlightenment, which means transcending the physical through work on yourself. That's the form of meditation we're studying right now. We have a few additional ones coming up, and we'll be adding to the list as we go. What is this Ruach HaKodesh? Basically, Rabbi Kaplan, what's the question? Oh, okay. I thought the hand was, hello. Rabbi Kaplan mentions that there are sections of the soul, Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama. And he mentions that to ascend through the soul, you have to develop certain personality characteristics. And he got these from the Talmud. They are study, carefulness, diligence, cleanliness, abstention, purity, piety, humility, fear of sin, and holiness. So this, you have to become a certain type of person with these attributes in order to become enlightened. Keep that in mind, because we're going to be focusing on what kind of person you become when we talk about Gehenom, or as is commonly called, hell, and how to avoid it. Okay, we then learned a little bit from Ethan Dorshav in his article, Soul on Fire. And he talked about how, on a larger level, the parts of our soul, the bottom of which, by the way, is the body, the biosphere, integrate with its environment when you die. And there's a plant level, there's a water level, there's a wind level, there's a fire level. And when we die, those parts of us integrate with the larger environment. But our question was, well, what happens to you? What happens to me? What happens to the person that you identify with when you die? It's good to know what's happened on the larger scale, but what happens on the micro scale with the person? So to answer that question, we delved into another essay by Rabbi Kaplan, Immortality and the Soul, and we discussed questions such as, are you your body? Are you your brain? Are you your memories? Where do you go when you die? And we talked about somehow your thoughts and experiences integrating with God's memory, your memory integrating with God's memory. Very lofty concept. We'll have to get into that somehow. Okay. We then talked a bit about being naked before God, in the sense that we discussed what is immortality like and the purpose of the brain and the nervous system. We talked about it being a filter, the mental activity of the disembodied soul, looking at yourself, the idea that when you are alive, you use your brain as a filter, not just from the outside environment and filtering out excessive sounds and sights and everything, but it acts as a filter internally, where you screen yourself away from thoughts and feelings you don't want to deal with. It's an external filter and an internal filter. But the problem is, when you die and your brain and nervous system stop functioning, you're stuck with all the stuff internally that you've been avoiding. You had been using your brain as a filter to get rid of those, to hide from those, to rationalize those, to excuse those various things that you don't want to think about, but now you got to think about them. They're there in front of you. So he discussed looking at yourself and standing naked before God. You can't rationalize. And he talked about burning shame. Okay, so shame is a big deal here, which we'll get into. Burning shame, meaning you're looking at yourself and reacting to all the stuff you didn't want to deal with. Shame, shame, shame. We're going to really discuss more about shame and what's that like. To wrap up that essay, we talked about what the dead think of us, and we asked the question, do the dead know what is happening in the world of living? And we talked about post-body awareness and the body as the main source of attention, that there's some kind of awareness post-body. And you're aware of everything out there that you previously had been filtering. There's a lot going on, and you see objectively your body. And since you've been so used to your body and you've identified so much with your body when you're alive, that stays as your main source of attention. And that's why we have utmost respect for human remains, because there's a sense of sympathy for that disembodied entity, not wanting that entity has feelings still in a way for that body, and you want to treat the body respectfully, because otherwise that transcendent entity might be distraught, might get disturbed. So there's that kind of empathic feeling for that transcendent entity that transcends the physical, has this awareness, and still identifies with the body. And that entity, whatever we're going to call it, has to learn how to focus and adjust to this huge, expansive world that previously had been filtered out. But there's a gigantic emotional component to this, you might say. There's feelings going on and review of life. And there's the idea that the transition into fully the hereafter is made easier if somebody has had more of a spiritual orientation while they're alive. If somebody has been completely obsessed with the material, then they have a harder time detaching from the material when they're dead. So the more you have a spiritual inclination, the easier it is to transcend the physical. Now, I would like to just add that in no way, shape, or form, that to my understanding, does this imply a life of poverty or a life of doing without affluence or doing without wealth. Some of the most prominent spiritual advisors in Jewish history, the best thinkers, and the people who came up with a very well-developed spiritual outlook had immense wealth. They just didn't want to take it with them. So we're not talking about people doing without here necessarily. You can have a lot, but just not take it for granted. Okay. So that brings us to today, where we're going to take a deep dive on what is called Gehenom. And if you recall, in the essay on immortality and the soul, Rabbi Kaplan said this: a number of our great teachers write that the fire of Gehenom is actually the burning shame one experiences because of his sins. And then he said, we find that evil leads to shame. Evil leads to shame. Okay. So automatically he's making the point that true shame, this awful feeling you get when you can't hide from yourself anymore and you're confronted with all the bad stuff you did, that stuff you did is evil. And that's my starting point here, because there's shame and then there's shame, and there's sins and then there's sins. And I think we're talking about a very specific classification of bad things people do when we're talking about burning in hell here. And that's what we're going to get into. So we're going to ask the questions: what sins are evil, and how does the pursuit of Ruach Hakodesh help us avoid them? Remember that Ruach Hakodesh is transcending the physical. You attain that by transcending the physical through work on yourself and attaining these personality characteristics that we identified, all the way from study through holiness. Okay. As you can see already, somebody who tries to develop these personal qualities, study, carefulness, and everything else through fear of sin and holiness, odds are that person's not going to be committing evil deeds. Okay. So you can see already that somebody who's on the path to enlightenment and is using work on himself to get there, meaning developing himself into a certain kind of person, that kind of person should have a much easier transition when he dies, frankly, because he has no shame or very little shame. And again, as I'm interpreting this, there's shame and then there's shame. Meaning you can feel ashamed. People always feel ashamed. You spoke to somebody badly, you provoked an argument with a loved one, whatever. There are things to be ashamed of that have to be rectified. But are these the kinds of things that make you burn in hell or a Gehenom when you die, so that it's an unbearable experience and is burning in fire like we've been told? No, I'm saying that there's a whole different classification of stuff that really is evil. That's what gets you to burn. So that's the point. Okay, now we're going to be learning from Judith S. Antonelli in this magnificent book, and I don't hesitate by saying magnificent, In the Image of a God. She wrote a commentary on the Torah based on a feminist perspective, and what's feminist about it is she took the woman's point of view in the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, and commented on what the Torah teaches us about the role of women, the plight of women, as characterized in the Torah. And she makes the point that the Torah is definitely from Sinai. There's a revelation at Sinai. That's a traditional fundamental point of view. And one of its benefits is that it improved the status of women. And once you look at what was happening to women in the pagan cultures at the time, and still takes place in certain cultures, you realize, boy, was Judaism an improvement. And she takes it a step further and says that misogyny and discrimination against women and mistreatment of women and putting women in a second class comes from Jews, not from the Torah. It's not a biased, misogynist document. And she uses traditional Jewish sources, Tanakh, Talmud, Medrash, Kabbalah, and very importantly for our purpose, she uses a lot of other disciplines: history, anthropology, sociology, psychology, ancient religion, and feminist theory. She is a fantastic resource for understanding the cultural environment in which the Hebrews were formed as a nation, and what practices and influences they got from the outside culture. And she's really good at pointing out, well, this Jewish practice upgraded that pagan practice so that women weren't used and abused and things like this. So we're going to call upon her great research into pagan cultures to talk about Gehenna and the evil things you have to do to get there. Okay. So we're going to start page 309. We're right here. So she quotes from the book of Leviticus and says this. This is from the Torah. Every man from the children of Israel or from the converts that live in Israel who gives a seed to Molech, an entity called Molech, shall be put to death. The people of the land shall pelt him with stones. I, meaning God, will set my face against that man and cut him off from among his people, because he gave his seed to Molech and therefore made my mikdash tameh, God's sanctuary tameh, and desecrated my holy name. And if the people of the land avert their eyes from this man who did this, the man giving his seed to Molech, and do not put him to death, I will set my face against that man and his family, and will cut him off, and all the zonim after him, who leaves note after Molech among their people. We'll get into these words in a second, but we're talking about child sacrifice here to some entity named Molech. Okay, that's mentioned in the Torah. We don't do that. Okay, and then she starts with a commentary. Giving one's seed, that is one's child, your own child, to Molech is one of the 36 sins punishable by karet or divine excision. Nevertheless, society had the responsibility to rid itself of men who did this to their children. The Jewish court was supposed to put the man to death, but if for some reason it did not, the people themselves had to kill him. That's a commentary from Rashi. If society chose to ignore or deny what was going on, then even of the members of the man's family would be punished by God as collaborators, in addition to anyone else who degraded themselves by worshiping Molech. That's very serious stuff. Those people that sacrificed their children, there was a mandate, get rid of those people, kill them. Okay, now, to what extent this happened, that's another course of study, but the point is, these are very serious infractions, and this is what happened, as we will see, in the cultures surrounding the Jews all the time. Social denial is complicity, and it is rapidly self-perpetuating. And there's a quote, if they conceal one thing, in the end they will conceal many things. If the small Sanhedrin of 23 judges conceals, in the end the great Sanhedrin of 71 judges will conceal. You can't pretend it didn't happen. This was so prominent, so predominant, it happened all the time, and it could easily seep into the Jewish people. And God is basically saying, you know, you do that, you bring this into my place, you're dead. You can see the seriousness of not doing this. So then she goes on, who was Molech, and what did it mean for a man to give his seed to him? Molech has the same root as Melech, king, reflecting the pagan reality that where the king is God, the God is king. That's the nature of the society that we grew up in. Molech may have been a generic name for any god worshipped with this particular rite, meaning child sacrifice. For, she quotes in the Gemara, the same law applies to whatever they proclaimed as their king, even a pebble or a splinter. So whether they might say that this pebble is Molech, we're sacrificing our child to this pebble, still counts as a horror, can't do it. There were two phases of the rite: handing the child over, and causing it to pass through fire. 2 steps to the sacrifice. A Jewish man was culpable only if he completed both phases. The law applied to any of his grandchildren or illegitimate offspring as well. So you can't just say, well, I didn't technically sacrifice my son. I sacrificed my grandson. Sorry, no good. Okay. And we're not here to discuss the halakha of all this stuff. We're talking about what's important here. Molech was well known to the Jews from Egypt, according to the Ramban, Nachmanides, but is also said to be the Ammonite god Milcom. That's from the Book of Kings. So Molech, Milcom, looks like it's the same entity. Molech is described throughout prophets as being worshipped in a place called Gehenom. Sorry, that's supposed to be a Gehenom. Let's put that over here. Gehenom. The valley of the son of Gehenom, south of Jerusalem, and he is sometimes linked to the Canaanite god Baal, as well as to something called Tophet. And she quotes various sources in Tanakh. Okay, we're going to get into this Gehenom place because it exists, and it's actually a tourist attraction in Israel now. Okay, so again, Molech was known to the Egyptians. Milcom was known to the Ammonites. It looks like they're the same thing. There was worship of this entity in a place called Gehenom, the valley of the son of Gehenom, south of Jerusalem. Okay, and in addition, the Canaanite god Baal is also associated with this Molech and this Milcom, as is something called Tophet. We don't know if that's an entity or not, but all these various entities, descriptions of entities, seem to be similar, and they all have to do with child sacrifice. Okay. There are other ones called Adramelech and Anamelech, other gods to whom children were offered, and they may also have been Molechs, as indicated by the word Melech in their names. So basically, she's going across various cultures, Egypt and Ammonite and Canaanites. They all had some form of child sacrifice to appease some god. And whether or not they're all referring to the same God is almost besides the point, but that was a form of worship. Okay, and how do we know? Because there's some form of malach, that refers to God/king, and the entity to which they're making these sacrifices. She goes on. Some commentators believe that offering a child to Molech was merely an initiation rite for the child that consecrated him or her to Molech. They're basically saying, well, there's some understanding that says he was initiated, but he wasn't killed. The child was not killed, but what happened? The father handed his child over to the priest. They lit 2 large piles of wood and made the child pass on foot between the fires. There was a loose pile of bricks in the middle and fire on either side of it. It was like the children's leaping over a bonfire on Purim. She quotes the Gemara there. So she says there's one point of view that says that the children were handed over to a priest. Remember, there's 2 parts here. There's a handing over part and there's a fire part. And there's one perspective that says, well, there was a handing over part, but as far as getting to the priest, but as far as to the fire, it's like a running thing, not a burning thing. She says she's doing her job and trying to cover bases, and says, well, there's one base that says here it wasn't the murder of the child. And she even quotes the Rambam, who takes this idea. The Rambam says as follows: one lights a big fire and takes some of his seed and delivers it to the priests. Again, seed is children who serve the fire. After it is delivered into their hands, the priests give the child back to its father to pass in the fire with his permission. The father of the child is the one who passes his child upon the fire with the priest's permission. They go back up. Can I do it? Can you do it? Can I do it? Can you do it? he passes it while walking from one side to the other in the midst of the flames. He does not burn it, meaning the child, to Molech, as sons and daughters are burned in other idol worship. So a technicality here, again, she's doing her due diligence and trying to be thorough. He says, well, technically, according to the Rambam, yeah, there were cultures that were sacrificing children and burning them to death, but this particular form of Molech worship did not involve burning the child. There was fire, but the child didn't get burned to death. So, okay. However, she quotes another source, the Ramban, Nachmanides, who says, and his viewpoint is backed by several of the prophets that she's referred to, that the child was actually sacrificed by being burned in the fire. And there's a quote here, they made the child pass through the flames many times until he or she died in the burning fire. Molech worship may have differed from child sacrifice to other deities only in the details of how the burning was done. Alternately, the burning to Molech may have been a form of sorcery used for divination and prophecy. And here she quotes a sociologist who studied pagan cultures to back up what the Ramban, Nachmanides, said here in terms of the burning of the children. And this author says, in order to renew the solar fires, human victims may have been sacrificed to the idol by being roasted in its hollowed body or placed on its sloping hands and allowed to roll into a pit of fire. It was in the latter fashion that the Carthaginians sacrificed their offspring to Molech. The children were laid on the hands of a calf-headed image of bronze, from which they slid into a fiery oven, while the people danced to the music of flutes and timbrels to drown the shrieks of the burning victims. Again, this is a scholar who studies pagan cultures, and describing they had some huge bronze slide type thing, and parents took their children, put them at the top, and these children slid down into the oven at the bottom of the statue, screaming, shrieking, and to drown out the shrieks, they played music. And then she goes on, this explains the name Tophet associated with Melech, for Toph is the Hebrew word for timbrel. Another account echoes this description. So again, we're talking about, this is a quote now from an expert in idolatry. In Carthage, we find that the sacrifice of children was performed at a great image with a bull's head and human body. The image was of metal and made hot by fire kindled within it, and the children laid in its arms, rolled from them into the fiery lap below. Rabbi Simeon says, so he's quoting a Jewish source, in speaking of the statue of Molech outside Jerusalem, quote, it was a statue with the head of an ox and the hands stretched out as a man who opens his hands to receive something from another. It was hollow within. The child was placed before the idol and a fire made under it until it became red hot. Then the priest took the child and put him into the glowing hands of Molech, and lest the parents should hear his cries, they beat drums to drown the noise. So we said earlier that the word toph, was used in conjunction with this Molech worship. It's a sound, a beating, like percussion instrument, and this assumption is that the reason why that word is associated with this child sacrifice is that is the instrument that was used to drown out the screams of the child they were burning to death in some sort of pagan sacrifice. I know this is ugly stuff, but we are talking about Gehenom. Okay. And she mentions another account. Child sacrifice was a specialty of the Carthaginians, inherited from their Phoenician and Canaanite ancestors. In honor of Baal, who was both sun god and god of fire, the children were rolled down into a fiery pit in the shape of the image of the god. The image was itself known as Molech, and In a site near modern Tunis, 6,000 urns containing the charred remains of infants were found. In earlier times, Baal had demanded the sons of nobles, but the latter-day Carthaginians secretly bought and bred poor children for the purpose. So there's this industry, trafficking, child trafficking industry, and the Carthaginians, you could buy a kid to sacrifice. And in this excavation near Tunis, 6,000 urns were found by the archaeologists containing the remains of the children that were sacrificed. She continues, the urns that have been found contain mostly cremated infants under age 2, but also some remains of children up to age 12. Quote from this research, here for the first time, sufficient evidence accumulated to show conclusively that the ancient stories of Phoenician and Canaanite infant sacrifice to Molech were only too true. It is now clear that other people's detestation of the Phoenicians for such a practice was founded on fact. So they're referring here, there obviously was some reputation of the Phoenicians for being barbaric like this, and there's scientific evidence, there's archaeological evidence to back up. That's what these people did. And she says the secular sources are in turn confirmed by a lost medrash. A medrash is it was a commentary on Torah that sometimes speaks in hyperbole but drives home a message. And Medrash says as follows. Although all the pagan shrines are in Jerusalem, the Molech was outside Jerusalem. We just said it's South Jerusalem. That site was in southwest of Jerusalem. It was made as a hollow idol with 7 rooms. If one would sacrifice fine flour, they would open one room for him. So there's the image is this whole place where you make sacrifices. If you make sacrifice fine flour, there's 1 room. If you sacrifice turtle doves or young pigeons, there's 2 rooms. If you sacrifice a lamb, you get 3 rooms. If you sacrifice a ram, there's 4 rooms. If you sacrifice a calf, there's 5 rooms. If you sacrifice an ox, there's 6 rooms. If you sacrifice your son, you get all 7 rooms. And there's an entity in this building, like that of a calf. Its hands are extended as one does to receive something from his friends. They would heat it with fire. Then the priest would take the child and place him in the hands of Molech, where he would let out his soul. So there's a medrash as a commentary that backs up this secular research into what into the child sacrifice these pagans were doing. She goes on. Gehenom, the valley of the son of Gehenom, is also called the valley of slaughter. Usually this area, which today lies south of Mount Zion and west of Silvan, is simply called the valley of Gehenom or Gehenom. So she's making the point that the Gehenna, or the plural Gehenom, this word we've been using that Rabbi Kaplan used, is a, I forget what we call it, is a version of Gay Ben Hino, this place where the sacrifices took place. Gehenom, or sometimes Gehenna, is the Jewish term for what Christianity calls hell and the prince of Gehenna. The prince of Gehenna is the Satan, the prosecuting angel who is combined with the pagan Satyr to form the Christian devil Satan. Thus, the image of hellfire is rooted in the revulsion toward pagan child sacrifice. So again, Gehenom refers to the place where what was happening, burning of children up to age 12 as some kind of foul, wrong worship. There is one Jewish view that the totally righteous inherit eternal life, the totally wicked are doomed to Gehenna, and those in between will go down to Gehenom and squeal and rise. Okay. For the most part, however, Judaism rejects the concept of eternal damnation after death. Even a wicked soul is believed to spend only a year in Gehenom, becoming purified through fire before it ascends to heaven, which is Gan Eden or paradise. While some biblical verses refer to sons and daughters being passed through the flames, others simply say sons, which of course could be generic for children. However, it is highly likely that the worship of Molech frequently consisted of a father's sacrifice of his firstborn son. Firstborn son sacrifice was common in the ancient world for a number of reasons, such as a belief that offering the firstborn would cause a man to father many more sons. So one reason why, she's stating one reason why these pagans sacrifice their children was the belief that if you sacrifice your firstborn son to this god, you'll be blessed with more children, in particular, more sons. Okay. One last point. There is a link between incest and idolatry in Jewish sources. She quotes the Talmud, "The Israelites knew that there was no reality in idolatry, but they worshipped idols because it allowed them to publicly commit the sexual prohibitions. That is why the term zinut is used for both sexual degradation and idol worship." Furthermore, the Mishnah demands that two kinds of people should be silenced: those who speak in euphemisms about the sexual prohibitions, and those who render "you shall not give your seed to pass over to Molech," who misconstrue that phrase. So she's saying that very often this murder of this in this idol worship featured some kind of sexual degradation. And in another chapter, she talks about that. And it should be noted that, there was with the building of the golden calf, there was even Rashi says there was an orgy, there was sexual bad stuff going on as they were worshiping. Now, there's a debate over to what extent that was idol worship, but they definitely had imported some kind of pagan idol worship somehow from their experience in Egypt. She doesn't, and here, in this chapter here, we're talking about just the murder, not the sexual stuff, but she says there's a link here. And she wraps it up by quoting none other than Freud, who said, she says, "Interestingly, before Freud abandoned his seduction theory, he linked Molech worship with incest. I am beginning to grasp an idea," he wrote to Fleiss in January 1897. "It is as though in the perversions of which hysteria is the negative, we have before us a remnant of a primeval sexual cult, which once was, perhaps still is, a religion in the Semitic East, such as Molech or Astarte." So even Freud is linking hysteria and perversion to this pagan child sacrifice worship. Okay. So why did we take this grotesque tour through pagan child sacrifice? It's because I I'm putting down the point here that this is why you burn in Gehenna. This is why you burn in hell, because of the Gehenom activity or the Gehenom activity. So I'm putting out the idea that you do stuff like this, then that's what makes you toast. And even Antonelli Dan says, even those guys sometimes, after a year, they make it out anyway. So that's why when people like Rabbi Kaplan say, a number of our great teachers write that the fire of Gehenom is actually the burning shame one experiences because of his sins, and we find that evil leads to shame. You can bet that those people that burned their children and played music so that they drown out the cries of the tortured kids and all this other stuff, and the parents that gave their kids, that burned up their kids in this to appease this God to make them more fertile, that's got to be a pound load of shame. And it's obviously got to be a worse feeling than the shame we feel because you were just rude to somebody or disrespectful and, the stuff that ordinary good people do. So that is what I'm saying. And just to wrap up here, I think I'm going to continue this for next class. A little bit more on Gehenom from the Jewish Encyclopedia. And we'll see if we can talk a little bit more about evil too. But the Jewish Encyclopedia backs up a bit what Judah Antonelli is saying. Yeah, we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Okay, that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do. Due to the time, I'm going to save the tip on meditation for next week. I'm going to go right to the meditation.